Okay, here we are. It's a Thursday afternoon, and Elliot has been, I don't have the right term for it. He's been typing away. What have you been typing, brother? Because I feel like this is a great rant that needs to be recorded for posterity.
So on the mass drop for the Crux, someone asked what the difference is between 1 or 2 points of Rockwell hardness. And that's actually a vastly more difficult question to answer than I think most people think. For the most part, in the knife industry, there's a lot of glossing of the slightly more, no, not slightly, the definitely more hardcore science that goes into metallurgy. And so...
No, it's a hard science.
Literally.
I apologize. Everybody who's watching this, I'm sorry. He can't help it. It comes from our father. Continue.
So an explanation of the difference between 1 or 2 points of Rockwell C-scale hardness difference, I said difference twice, is vastly more complicated than what most people think of, because for lack of a better sort of cross-class comparative term, Rockwell hardness has sort of become the default, even though, in my opinion, as a knife maker, it's one of the least important attributes to a steel that goes into a good knife blade. You really want me to go on with this? Because it's going to get
we're going for it. It's fresh in your brain. I'm recording it.
Okay.
Because here we go, right?
Oh, gird your loins.
Well, this is, you've put a lot of thought into this. This hasn't just come about from one day you were sitting there and had these ideas.
1 day?
No, it's been more like 8 years.
Yeah, almost a decade.
A couple thousand knives.
Of
a lot of research, a lot of experiments.
Of research and then actual testing of stuff. That's
theory's all fun and good.
Yeah, theory.
How does it work in the real world?
But how does it actually affect what we do to a knife, the steel choices we make for a knife? And there is hyperbole, especially in the knife world, because we are selling a consumer good. In other industries that utilize the steels that we actually use in knives, they don't care about consumers because they are making products that go into other products, or they are making the tools that make another product. So it is a little bit more geared toward science in those areas. And so when I look at a steel, I try and find test data that doesn't come from the knife world. I want stuff that is industrial, because industry, outside of making knives, industries are concerned with the overall productivity ratio for any given material. My favorite instance of this is the plastics industry, which most of the high carbide martensitic stainless steels that we use in knives actually were made with the plastics industry in mind.
What steels are you referring to? Sorry, I'm the voice of let's bring it back down to what everybody else understands.
So, steels like the S series from Crucible, that's S30, S35VN, S90, S110, S125V, those were designed for plastics. We'll use some of Böhler-Uddeholm's numbers because they're a little bit more out there in the public. M390 was designed for plastics industry. LMAX as well. There are very few steels that are used in knives that were actually designed for knives. ZDP 189 is one of the few that was specifically designed for cutlery. 154CM was designed for aerospace. What else we got in there? What's in the usable one? D2 is a tool steel. It's used in all kinds of other things besides knives. Anything else? Some of the new CTS stuff, XHP, where they have like BD1. They have another 440C variant. I can't remember its name. they, while being marketed to the knife world, are actually being made and manufactured into stuff that gets used for other industries like plastics and aerospace. Because plastics and aerospace are looking for two really important things. They are looking for the price point of the material, and how machinable and workable it is into the component that they need, and then they are looking at the longevity of the component. So longevity translates into a couple of physical characteristics that are important to us as knife users. They want to know about the wear resistance. How long before that part loses enough dimension to where it cannot fulfill its role?
Hold this for a second.
I'm holding this.
Right like that.
Right like this?
Don't move it.
Like this? Right here.
You're good.
Right here.
You're good.
Oh, whoa. Whoa, guy. I don't know what you're doing. So,
yeah, it's probably a little better.
Wear resistance to us in the knife world translates into how difficult a knife is to sharpen, and then how long it stays sharp.
So let me circle back real quick. So this is back to the idea that Rockwell Hardness is...
this is all about how I get to explain the difference between 1 or 2 points of Rockwell C hardness.
Yep. But your point that you were making before we went down a bit of a rabbit hole was that Rockwell Hardness only tells a little part of the story of a steel.
It gives us a little snippet of information that we can draw some inference from, and so because it has the most comparison-based number that we can attribute to various steels across the menu of steels that knives come in, it gives us a point of comparison. Even though if we take, let's say, a knife blade in D2 at 60 Rockwell, and we take a knife blade in 20 CV at 60 Rockwell, they actually have very different performance characteristics. One is going to stay sharper longer, it's the 20 CV. One is going to have very different impact characteristics. Depending upon the heat treat, it could be the 20 CV. So it doesn't tell anywhere close to the whole story, and I mean we still use Rockwell numbers in some of our marketing and stuff because people want to know. It's a number that people have a comparison. They understand what 61 Rockwell generally means. Well, at least they think they do. Some people actually do. But to that point, if you look up the material specifications on a sort of science-based material website like MatWeb or MatSci or something, there's a whole bunch of them. Just type in material science, it'll take you to websites that have scientific standardized test-related data for any given material type that you can possibly dream up, for the most part, unless they're very new.
Numbers, science, numbers.
Yes, basically. Okay. One of the things that will usually be missing from those is a Rockwell hardness. It's something that engineers really don't care all that much about because it's not that important when your concern is how long a part is going to be able to last, where a wear resistance number is much more important. A machinability number is much more important to control the cost of generating that component. The corrosion resistance is much more important if you're going to be putting that component in a place where it's going to be around caustics or salt water or vapors of various kinds. So those are the things that are sort of the aim goals of a lot of the steels that we use in the knife world. It just so happens that they do have some correlation to a number like their Rockwell hardness. I think that's relatively clear.
Mm-hmm. Okay, keep it going. I'll ask you to clarify along the way.
So my explication of the difference between 59 and 61 Rockwell C in S35VN, it took us down a pathway of understanding wear. So there's different kinds of wear. This is where this gets really slippery. There's different kinds of wear. There's abrasive wear, adhesive wear, erosive wear. There's a whole slew of them. And there are tests that correspond to them as well, ASTM standardized tests. thing is, those numbers are kind of boring, and they are often situated as a comparison because you have the material you're testing and then what you're testing it against. Is it a tungsten carbide? Is it some kind of abrasive, some kind of ceramic? Is it being tested against ruby, diamond? And so those test numbers are not readily available, and they're not concise, and they're really just not sexy. So they don't get used very much, they don't get talked about very much. But to me, as a guy that has to try and pick a steel for a knife, like especially our knives, it's one that I'm really concerned about. Not only am I concerned about like the edge retention, which is one of my favorite made-up words in the knife world, edge retention. I'm also concerned about how it interacts with the other components in the knife. How does it going to react with the pivot? What does the wear look like with that? Because that is actually a part that is in constant contact. What's happening there? There's going to be some adhesive wear, some abrasive wear. How are those things going to interact over time? How long before we have to replace a pivot? I don't actually have an answer for that because I haven't found one that actually needs to be replaced yet. I'm concerned about impact, not because I think people are going to be, chopping stuff with their pocket knife or batoning through wood with their pocket knife, but because I need to know what they're going to do when they interact with the stop pin on the knife, because that is something where there's impact constantly. I asked the same question about stop pins. What's the impact resistance of that stop pin? At what heat treat for whatever given material we're going to make that stop pin out of? And then I also have to ask the question of cost. How much is it going to cost me to make a stop pin out of a really impact resistant material? Usually the answer is a whole hell of a lot. So it's finding a more readily available material that has a balance of property to where it's going to A, fit the budget, and B, last for a long time. So that was the wear resistance question leading into airplane. There's an airport by us, and we have Miramar, which used to be Top Gun. So wear resistance and impact resistance are things that matter to me a lot, and it just so happens that they are correlated enough to the hardness number to where when I'm achieving the wear resistance that I want, both from a cutting standpoint and from a mechanical standpoint, and when I'm achieving impact resistance to some extent on the cutting ability, but more so on the mechanical ability, I'm also going to end up with a steel that tends to be at a high Rockwell hardness. It tends to be 60 and above. We can further play with that number and skew it with the heat treat that we use for that particular steel. So I don't think we have ever run a steel in a pocket knife that was under 60. Sometimes that's pushing the limit of the steel. In the case of like a Z finite, 60-61 is the upper bound of its achievable hardness without making it too brittle or doing something strange to it that there wasn't any test data to see. In a steel like 20 CV, we are not at the upper bound of its hardness level. For our 200 piece knives, we keep it at 60-61 because that way it's not super difficult to sharpen. When we do 20 CV heat treat here in-house, which is rare, I actually will bump them up to 63-64.
Yeah, those dashies are going to be fun.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between 60-61 and 63-64 is very noticeable in 20 CV. It just so happens that with the heat treat that we use to achieve 63-64, we are also achieving a maximum level of wear resistance, and this data comes from the plastics industry. A maximum level of wear resistance as well as an impact resistance that is at the peak of capability for 20 CV. Who knew? Because sometimes things that are usually mutually exclusive, sometimes they are not in complex systems like high alloy stainless steels. So back to the S35VN differences.
So, in the specific case of S35VN,
one of the problems that I have in describing S35VN from a more scientific standpoint is that there is a sparsity of actual data, because S35VN really didn't get adopted by too many other industries besides knives, and so there isn't.
Those assholes better not be using my Dremels.
There isn't any really published that I found that's not anecdotal. And by anecdotal, I mean somebody doing some cut tests or some pry tests or something with it and saying, "Oh, this works better." I want real data. I want real numbers that I can make as concrete statements as I possibly can based on other people's data. So, lacking actual data of what the real physical properties look like for S35VN at 58, 59. There's a certain knife company that uses it at that exclusively in all of their knives. And then what it looks like at 60, 61, lacking any real data, I have to surmise based on what we can infer from their Rockwell hardness numbers and how they correlate to other physical characteristics. So there is a linear correlation between Rockwell hardness and tensile strength. Tensile strength is when you pull something and how much force is needed to pull to begin deforming it or breaking. Think of silly putty.
I love silly putty.
Chris loves silly putty. No one does that to knives. It's not part of their operating paradigm. But tensile strength does have correlations to other kinds of strength, like the flexural strengths. These usually get classed in material specifications.
Are you getting into a correlation of a correlation right now?
Yeah.
Correlationception.
This is why it gets murky really quick. So flexural strengths usually get termed as like yield strength, ultimate yield, 2% yield. These things are important for us to know as knife makers because they tell us how much we can expect, how much force is going to be needed to elastically deform a knife blade where it'll bend and come back, plastically deform it where it'll bend and stay bent, and then like an ultimate failure where it just breaks. This is important.
Who breaks pieces of metal?
This is important not only for, you know, how much abuse a knife will take if it's being used as a pry bar, which I don't recommend, but also how much we can expect the edge to either roll or chip, given what it's interacting with. I'll go to edge retention and why it's an interesting made-up term that really means nothing. There's no standardized test for it. The closest thing is Catra, but Catra lacks an ability to cross-compare steels that are in different knives because the geometries of the cutting area that's being tested has as much to do with the amount of wear that goes into the blade as does the actual steel itself. I one time went through and just did a rough calculation of how many steels there are in the world that are in knives and how many different harnesses they get used at that I could find, and then how many different Catra tests would have to be done if you were to make the same blade shape out of every single steel at different harnesses that it gets used at currently.
My God, you need to sleep more.
And that number gets astronomical. I mean, we start talking about hundreds of thousands of test pieces that have to get made.
I remember.
And so that cost gets up into the millions upon millions of dollars just to enable us to have a actual standardized edge retention.
Yeah,
so,
I remember talking about this.
Yeah. So there's no such thing as a standardized edge retention test, and so edge retention is sort of this ethereal quality that we give to knives, somewhere based around their Rockwell hardness.
It's an anecdotal quality.
For sure. And then there's no real definition of sharp. This is a really tough one. I've talked to other people that manufacture and do coatings on scalpel blades, and they came up with their own special little test, which I thought was really interesting. And they sent the same scalpels that they tested and that their test says are sharp. And anecdotally, doctors were saying, these are the sharpest scalpels we've ever used. They sent those exact same scalpels to Catra. Catra says they're dull. So it's very challenging to determine what sharp is in any kind of scientific sense. Now, you and I, like, we cut stuff and we go, oh yeah, this is sharp. And so I think sharp gets has to be qualified as the point at which it cuts a specific material with a specific force, and then the point at which it stops doing that we call not sharp. That's it. What dull means? Ultimate failure to cut anything, maybe?
Well, I like the example that you gave of saw blades. I mean, you can tell the difference between a sharp and a dull saw blade very quickly, but it doesn't have an edge necessarily like a knife. It's based on the teeth. So, you know, a sharpness test for a knife blade wouldn't function to determine sharpness of other cutting things.
Well, this is why I think sharp, like so many other terms in the knife world, is a comparative adjective, not a actual description of quality. It's sharp compared to something else that is less sharp or not sharp. It's a tough one, for sure. So this leads me back to what are the qualities that can create a knife that stays sharp, whatever that means, longer. And so the two main qualities that I've already stated, but I'll go back to it, are wear resistance, because one of the dulling agents, the thing that removes sharpness from a knife, is the wear resistance of the steel. And then its impact resistance vis-a-vis its yield strength. So wear resistance and yield are two things that matter more to me to determine how sharp a knife can stay over a given set of use paradigm, which is always hard to determine.
So let me pull you back into a bit of reality here. So in regards specifically to a knife, where we have a general idea of what makes a knife cut well, as the sort of parameter of sharpness, and what has to occur at the edge, and the geometry and refinement that has to happen to bring that leading edge to, you know, the as fine as possible. So in terms of the knife, when you're talking about cutting through and you get little abrasives and things, aside from just like scratching the metal, more at the microscopic level, how is that wear, you know, reducing the refinement of that cutting edge?
It's because of the two different kinds of wear that are primary to
go for it, baby.
Just
go for it.
To the wear that we see on metals when they're interacting with a substrate that they're going through.
Like cardboard. Let's use cardboard.
A really fantastic example, actually. In a hypothetical test that I set up in the piece that I was writing, I actually talked about PVC tape, so electrician's tape. So we see abrasive wear, which is where particles are interacting with each other, there's friction amongst them, and both the thing that is moving through and the thing that is stationary, they're interacting with each other, and some of their particles are coming off together. This is abrasive wear.
Like sandpaper.
Like sandpaper. There's this really nebulous one that's called adhesive wear that's actually fairly important, and it has a distinction of adhesive wear
important nebulous
and cohesive wear. And this is the one I actually, since I don't have good terms for it, I actually quoted something because I thought it was breathtakingly complex, but does a better job than I can.
Speak loudly.
So, I'm quoting. Adhesive wear is caused by relative motion, direct contact, and plastic deformation, which creates wear, debris, and material transfer from one surface to another.
Can you translate that into English for
Nope.
us.
In case of thermodynamic systems, the fricohesity plays a master role and quantitatively explain a dilution work to be undertaken or materialized by putting cohesive energy of solvent into distributing energy of mixtures, allowing solute molecules to be distributed among the solvent phase with higher entropy. The solvent with higher cohesive force gains higher potential energy and least entropy.
What the hell does that mean?
So I'm gonna Bill Nye that one and simple that down.
You can go very specific with a knife, right? In terms of knife steel and interaction of materials.
Well, we gotta go all the way down to molecules,
Okay.
maybe even atoms. So, the thing that gives our physical world shape is atoms' ability to stick together, to bond. And atoms are bonding all of the time around us, and breaking their bonds all around us all the time. In the instance of cutting something and adhesive wear, what we're having is molecules that are in that steel, whether it is iron, carbon, vanadium, molybdenum, chromium, nitrogen in some cases. Some of those atoms are bonding to the atoms that are in the thing that you are cutting. They're sticking together and they're being pulled apart, sometimes at the exact same time, and whatever they bonded into, whatever quick little molecule they've created, is coming off, and they're adhesively stuck together and coming off together. This is happening all the time. How it differs from abrasive wear is that abrasive wear, I think, based on the definitions I'm reading, is happening at a larger scale level where you are having molecules or groups of molecules that are being ripped off by something in the substrate that you're cutting.
Okay.
So over time, right, over that material that is cutting, moving through the material that is being cut, you've got these two forces that are taking stuff away from the apex, the angle that we put on, which is allowing for the bifurcation, the separating of the thing we are cutting. And so over time, that's being worn away, and until it gets to a point where it can no longer separate chemical bonds.
AKA cut through stuff.
AKA cut through stuff. And so then instead of cutting, then we start getting ripping and tearing, and it's well, you know the feeling. When that cuts through something, it's, when it starts ripping, it's, those are facts.
Yep.
Hope you like my sound effects.
Yeah.
So the other component that we see in there, when we start talking about the yield strengths and the flexural strength and the impact resistance, they're all sort of related into a resistance to deformation. So forces, whether they are in line with the actual major force of the motion, or if they're axial or lateral, or wherever the force is occurring, the way that they affect the material, I think plays a significant role, because there's also, as we're moving through materials, especially if they are more resistant to deformation, the more resistant to deformation the thing you are cutting is, the more force it is actually imparting on your knife. So let's think the difference between cutting a piece of paper and then cutting a piece of wood. So paper has very little resistance to deformation. Knife, if it's sharp, should be able to cut right through it. On wood, there's resistance, because it is resistant to deformation. And so it begins imparting force back onto the blade, and how the blade handles that force can determine what's going to happen along that really micro thin section of edge. So in something with high flexural strength, this is where this gets a little murky. With high flexural strength, which means it doesn't want to bend, it wants to stay in the shape that it is in, we actually see a higher instance of failure, where it's going to chip or crack a little section, especially in really, really thin sections. And we're talking like microns of thickness up at the edge. And so those little parts are just going to break off because they don't have the chemical bonding to stay where they are. In something with lower flexural strength, with lower yield strength, it means it actually will bend. And so it will bend with those forces that are being put in there. And the question we have is it bending elastically? Will it come back, or is it going to be permanently bent? When we see that, we see like an edge rolling over, to where when you look at it, it looks like it's still sharp, but it doesn't cut anything anymore because the actual micro edge on there has rolled over and is now just a rounded piece of metal that can't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Is that relatively clear?
Yeah. And that's why we theorize that SM100, because it is so flexible down at that very, very fine cutting edge, rather than hitting abrasives and chipping, it's bending around, elastically deforming and coming back into position.
Yep.
That's the theory, at least.
Good theory. I like that.
We don't have microscopes to test that. If somebody wants to send us a microscope, we're down.
We need like a really powerful microscope.
That's cool. They can send us one.
So, going back to this whole question of Rockwell hardness. So what a Rockwell test actually is, it's just a machine. And it has a little probe. And the probe for Rockwell C is made of diamond. It is a cylinder that has a 120-degree cone. And so it is pushed into the material with a specific force. That is 150 kilogram force, which is the equivalent of having like 300 pounds put on it, 330 pounds. And then they measure how deep the divot is that it left. So the harder a material is, the less it has plastically deformed. And my phone is ringing. I'll be right back. I'm back.
Yay!
So we give it this term hardness, which means resistance to deformation, which is one of the things that we're concerned about anyway, but it's a very specific resistance to deformation. It is essentially a depth of penetration without removal of material. Because the Rockwell scale has been around for such a long time, there is a linear correlation now between Rockwell hardness and tensile strength. So that's where I think Rockwell hardness has some strength as a comparative mean for, we're trying to come up with something concrete about blades and a way to compare them. That's all I got.
All right, cool. Let's sign it off. You can watch it and listen to yourself and go,
Wow.
yeah.
Maybe you should do some editing.
I don't know, man. All right, sign it off.
Science Thursday, here with Elliot. Bye, everyone.